in May of 1915, and in that one battle, there were 300,000 French killed. And a lot of the fighting was bayonet fighting, up close. And he was very good. He was quick. He was light, and he was quick.
And then when he becomes a pilot, this is interesting because I know there's different ways that Americans were fighter pilots. Sometimes it was with the Foreign Legion, and then I think that was rolled up into the French Air Corps. There was a special unit, I think, of Americans before America formally entered the war. They called themselves the Lafayette Corps, something like that, named after the
Lafayette Escadrille.
Yeah, Lafayette Escadrille, named after the Marquis de Lafayette in the Revolutionary War.
Yep.
To make it very clear that even though we couldn't officially call ourselves Americans because the American government didn't want to signal they were leaning toward the Central or the Allied powers, but the Americans themselves made it very clear who we were. So how was Bullard involved as a fighter pilot?
He went to the French Aeronautical Club because he had been badly wounded, I should mention. So he could not, he was out of the infantry. He was too badly wounded, but he could still fly a plane, and he still wanted to fight for his home country. So he went to the French Aeronautics Club and joined them, had no problem joining them. He actually got his license. So he began to train. They gave him a SPAD, and he began to train with the SPAD, did extremely well, and he flew 23 missions, I believe it was, over France. And he was managed to shoot down 2 German planes. There was a point at which the Americans joined the war. And at that point, when the Americans joined the war, there was a guy already over there who was an American guy who was forming that American part of the Lafayette Escadrille. And Bullard, because he was American by birth, wanted to join that, but they refused him. This guy refused him because he was black.
So when he wins the Croix de Guerre, being recognized by the French government, what particularly was he honored for?
You know what? That's a good question, but I don't have the answer on that one. I know he was wounded March 5th, 1916 in Verdun. Mm-hmm. The battle was one of the longest battles in history. And that battle lasted 303 days, 714,000 casualties. Just a huge bloodbath. He was cited for bravery and heroics during the Battle of Verdun in 1917. He was cited in 1917 for what he had done in 1916.
Right.
And he had won that. So he had won that fighting for the Legionnaires.
Well, going to his life after the war, I'm sure he's feeling very conflicted about his homeland because on one hand, he's fighting on behalf of America for France before America formally enters the war with the Foreign Legion. On the other hand, he is snubbed by his homeland because they won't let him into the Lafayette Escadrille because he's black. So he stays in Paris after the war. Let's go through his life between the wars. What's his next step?
Yeah, when the war ended, he was 20 years old. And he started to pick up again with jazz drumming. And he connected with some very important people in Paris at that time. The United States was under Prohibition. And all the U.S. servicemen who were still in France, still hadn't come home yet, were kind of staying in Paris and staying in France because they were enjoying the nightclubs. And jazz was really just starting to become extremely popular. And Bullard was right in the middle of all this. He became the assistant manager for a guy who owned a number of jazz clubs in the Montmartre district of Paris, which is where jazz was raging. You had all kinds of talent in there. People like you've heard of, like Louis Armstrong. There were a couple others. There was one called Bricktop Smith. I forget her first name, though, but she was called Bricktop Smith. And there were a lot of other jazz people who became jazz greats during that time. And it all happened in the Montmartre district of Paris. You had guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway attending these bars. It was mostly entertainment for servicemen and mostly wealthy whites who all mixed into this jazz age time that they were having. And then the place was called Zelly's. There was a guy named Zelly who had owned nightclubs in New York and owned nightclubs in London, and now he was taking advantage of the jazz age in Paris. And he made Bullard assistant manager. And he also put Bullard in charge of recruiting new talent. So that was how he met a lot of these jazz greats. Later in his life, he would end up as the road guy for Louis Armstrong. because of the friendships, because of the ties that they had made back then in the 20s in the Jazz District. And that was when he met the daughter of a wealthy family in Paris. She was a white socialite, very, very wealthy family. And he married her, and they had 2 children in the process. And during this time, he had now worked his way from manager to co-owner, and from co-owner to owner of his own nightclub, which he called the Lafayette Escadrille. So he had a nightclub and he had a health club. Both were making very, very good money, but a lot of it was night work. And after a couple of years, his wife tired of the night work, and she said, "Listen, I would like to have you home at night. Can you find a way to just let other people manage this?" But like many of us, he wanted to manage it and do it himself. He said, "I just can't stay home and be your gigolo," was what he said in his diary. He said, "I have to be myself, and I have to work it myself and do it my own way." And they parted company, and when they did, he got custody of their 2 daughters. So now the 2 daughters were his responsibility. He's still in Paris, France. He is divorced, and the 20s moved into the 30s. By the late 1930s, the jazz clubs were no more, but he still had his health club. And in 1936, the French intelligence approached him and said, "Listen, we have troubles brewing with Germany again. And because you know 3 languages, because you're familiar in English, you're familiar in French, and you're very familiar in German, we need you to provide us with intelligence." So they assigned him a co-agent named Kitty. And this Kitty was pretty well connected. She was later able to take care of his daughters when he entered World War II, again with the French Foreign Legion. But he would tend tables, and he would mix with these German guys. There were 17,000 Germans living in Paris in 1937. And Paris intelligence knew that they needed to try and get their information and their people, their sources squared away. He was one of them. Josephine Baker, who was another great jazz singer, she was also a French intelligence agent. And they'd go by the tables, and the Germans never suspected. Here comes these black waiters. They didn't know it was owners. Here comes Bullard as a black waiter waiting on their table, and they're talking about strategies and what's going down and what Germany's going to do, never figuring he could understand German. But he passed a lot of that good information off to French intelligence during that time. And when war broke out in 1939, the French are fighting again. And he went back to the Legionnaires and joined again.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I'm really fascinated about that part of spycraft, that it's not about the James Bond person you send in who's the most visible, flashy target. It's the person that everybody overlooks, the guy who checks in coats in the cloakroom, the waiter, the person that just seems part of the background so people speak freely, and they shouldn't speak freely, but they do, but he's right there to gather that intelligence. So that's really amazing that he managed to fit into there right at that time. So when he rejoins the war effort in World War II, is he fighting again for the Foreign Legion?
He is, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to take a sidebar, if you don't mind,
yes,
on that intelligence, and about how it's the waiter, or it's the person you least expect. And this little sidebar, because you mentioned Lafayette before, because we talked about the Lafayette Escadrille. Lafayette had a spy in Yorktown who was a black guy. His name was Washington. And the British commander there at Yorktown, Cornwallis. And this guy was working in the staff for Cornwallis and working on delivering meals to the tables. He was just a lowly servant in Cornwallis's staff. He had reported back to Lafayette on a lot of the things that were going on, the British plans. When Lafayette made his victory tour in the United States, this was maybe 20 years or 30 years after the American Revolution ended. Lafayette is making the trip for Hero by carriage up from Yorktown. I think he went from Williamsburg to Yorktown. And the roads were lined, just solid lined with people who wanted to see Lafayette, who was treated as an American hero, even though he was a Frenchman. And Lafayette saw somebody in the crowd that he recognized. And he asked the driver to stop. And Lafayette jumped out of the carriage and went and hugged this black guy, just out of nowhere. And as the story goes, this guy was his spy at Yorktown. And they hugged, and there were just tears coming down their faces. And the guy said, I have a paper here that confirms my identity and the fact that I was in your employ in the Revolution. Would you mind signing it so I can legally buy property? And Lafayette said, of course. And he signed that paper, Lafayette. And that guy did raise a family on a nice farm that he was able to buy. And just a little side story. Didn't mean to take us off, but everything just kind of fit there for that story.
Yeah, great story. The name Lafayette, the man Lafayette, a lot of these things tie in together across the centuries. Absolutely. So going back to Jean Bullard's war service in World War II, how does he re-enter the war effort? Is he fighting for the Foreign Legion, I'm guessing, since the French government is under control, the Vichy French period? What does that all look like?
Pétain had given half of France, including Paris, to the Germans. He just literally surrendered them. And de Gaulle said, fight on. Forever we will be the everlasting flame of freedom. And those words meant a lot. In fact, we used the recording of that in part 2 of our story that we did called All Blood Runs Red. And we've got it playing this week at our podcast at 1001 Heroes. He joined the French Foreign Legion. The Germans are trying to shell Orléans. And Bullard is assigned machine gun detail on the opposite side of the river from the Germans. And there's a huge fight going on to take Orléans. And his daughters are there at a convent where they're receiving their education. Again, remember, they're under the care of Kitty Terrier, who was his co-agent. And she's at this convent, and she's making sure that his daughters are safe. So he's involved in that shelling, and he was in a platoon. There were 17 guys with him, and they were crossing a street, and a German shell hit, and it killed everyone in his group except for lightweight Bullard. And he didn't get killed by the blast. He got thrown up against a wall, and he suffered a spinal injury, and it was pretty rough. But after a couple of days, he was able to stand, to crawl out of there, and to stand, and to get water. And he was useless for fighting now. He joined refugees trying to get out of France and started on this line of refugees that was headed toward Biarritz. And there it is on the Spanish border. And he's trying to get to the Spanish border because if he can get there, at the Spanish border, they're able to board ships. At least the Americans were able to board ships, which they were sending back to New York City. He knew his daughters were well cared for. He was able to get word to them. They were able to get word back to him. Yes, we're being well cared for. Get back to New York. Come back for us when you can. In his diary, he recorded a lot of the trials that happened during this long escape that they were making from France, along with refugees. He was a soldier in a French uniform. If the Germans caught these refugees, he would be immediately executed. There just wasn't any two ways about it. And he was barely limping along. The first doctor he managed to find was the same guy who had doctored him up in World War I. Unbelievable. Here it is, 25 years later, and the doctor says, well, good to see you back. Good to see you still standing, Gene. And he gave him enough painkillers that he could make it through the rest of this march. And in his diary, he had put that here we are on this bridge to freedom, this last international bridge over to Spain. And we stopped, and his doctor had given him a couple bottles of wine. And the people were resting there on the bridge. And they were passing, he had passed his bottles. He said, I want to celebrate this with you. One of the families was called Levy. They were a Jewish family. They were escaping like tens of thousands of other Jews, trying to get the heck out of France. And the lady at first refused to take the bottle. And he said, I think you've got other worries than my microbes. He said, we're on an international bridge anyway. I would suggest you take a drink. It might do you well for your luck. And she smiled, and they did. And for him, it was a moment of peace among people. And you had all these different nationalities trying to get away from the Germans on this bridge and crossing over to Spain. And he made it.
And then from Spain, does he go directly to the United States on a hospital ship, or are there other intermediate steps?
He managed